What if I told you that one of the greatest inventions in human history was not a weapon, not a pyramid, not a throne, not even a masterpiece of art, but a number so powerful that you live inside it every single day of your life, even if you never think about it. 365 days. It sounds normal. It sounds boring. It feels like something nature simply gave us, like it always existed. But here is the question nobody asks. How did humans first discover the true length of a year? And more importantly, how did they discover it thousands of years ago, when the world had no telescopes, no satellites, no clocks, no computers, no calendars, and not even a modern understanding of astronomy? Because when you really think about it, this should be impossible. How do you measure something as large as time? How do you take the motion of the sun, something no human can touch, and turn it into mathematics? How do you look at the sky, watch stars appear and disappear, feel seasons change, and then somehow say a year is exactly this many days? And why would anyone in the ancient world even care? Unless their survival depended on it. Unless an entire civilization was balanced on one terrifying question. When will the Nile return? Because Egypt was not built on gold. Egypt was built on water. And the Nile was not just a river. It was a living force, a blessing, a threat, a miracle. Every year it flooded the land, leaving behind fertile soil, the black earth that could feed a nation. But it did not flood like a machine. It could come early, late, violently, softly. And imagine what that meant. If you planted too early, the water would swallow your crops. If you planted too late, you would starve. So tell me, how do you protect millions of people from hunger? How do you stop panic, chaos, rebellion? How do you create order in a world ruled by uncertainty? You don't build more armies. You don't build higher walls. You build something far more dangerous, a calendar. Because once you can predict the flood, once you can tell farmers when to plant, once you can tell workers when to harvest, once you can decide the exact day of festivals, rituals, taxation, and labor, then you are not just controlling time. You are controlling people. And this is what made ancient Egypt terrifyingly advanced. They didn't just build stone monuments. They built a system. They looked at the universe and tried to trap it inside rules. And here comes the most chilling part. They succeeded. Now picture a night in ancient Egypt. No electric lights. No noise of modern cities. Just darkness stretching across the desert. Above them, the sky looks like a giant ocean, filled with stars so bright they feel close enough to touch. And somewhere among those stars, one shines stronger than the rest. A star so bright it looks like a signal. Sirius, the brightest star in the entire night sky. The Egyptians didn't call it Sirius. They called it a divine messenger, a warning light, a key. Because they noticed something incredible. Every year, Sirius vanished for a time and then returned. And when it returned, appearing at dawn for the first time, something else returned too, the Nile flood. So let me ask you, was this coincidence? Or did ancient Egypt discover the world's first astronomical clock? Because if the priest could predict the rising of Sirius, and if the rising of Sirius predicted the flood, then the priests were no longer religious men. They were scientists. But in that world, science and religion were the same thing. To understand nature was to understand the gods. And to understand the gods was to hold power that ordinary people could never challenge. So now the questions become even bigger. How many years did they observe the sky before trusting this pattern? How did they count days without modern clocks? How did they synchronize the heavens with earth? And how did that observation transform into a number that still defines our lives today? Because somewhere in the temples of ancient Egypt, someone looked into the sky, counted the days between one cosmic event and the next, and discovered the secret rhythm of the planet. 365 days. Not a myth, not a guess, a calculation. And once they had it, they built their empire around it. So today we're uncovering the hidden truth behind the Egyptian calendar, how it was invented, why it was revolutionary, and how ancient Egypt captured time itself, long before the modern world even existed. Before ancient Egypt built pyramids, before it carved gods into stone, Before it became the most iconic civilization on Earth, Egypt had one simple, terrifying problem. Time was unstable. And when time is unstable, people panic. When time is unstable, food disappears. When time is unstable, empires collapse before they're even born. So let me ask you something. How do you build a civilization, an empire, when you cannot predict tomorrow? How do you control a country when your survival depends on a river that can rise without warning, destroy fields, delay harvests, or arrive too late and cause starvation? Because in ancient Egypt, the Nile River was not just a river. It was a living clock, a force that decided whether people ate or died. Every year, the Nile would flood the land. It sounded like a blessing, and it was. The floodwaters covered the fields and left behind black fertile soil, the richest soil Egypt had, soil so valuable that it literally created the civilization itself. But here's the problem most people forget. The flood wasn't a perfect machine. It didn't arrive on a predictable date like modern seasons written in a planner. Sometimes it came early, sometimes it came late, sometimes it came violently and destroyed villages. Sometimes it came weakly and left the land dry. And if you were an Egyptian farmer, that uncertainty was deadly. If you planted too soon, your seeds drowned. If you planted too late, you missed the season and your family starved. So you tell me, how long can a nation survive if farmers don't know when to plant? And now imagine that this wasn't just one family. This was millions of lives, entire cities, entire temples, an entire government. The Nile dictated everything: food, taxes, work, building, religion. So the rulers of Egypt faced a nightmare that sounds simple but is actually brutal. They needed to predict the flood, because prediction means preparation. Preparation means survival. Survival means stability, and stability is what creates empires. That is why the Egyptian calendar wasn't invented because Egyptians loved mathematics. It was invented because they feared chaos. They feared hunger. They feared rebellion. Because if a government can't control food, it can't control people. Now think about the political side. Egypt had kings, pharaohs, the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. But even a pharaoh called a god could not command the Nile. He could not threaten the river. He could not bribe it. He could not fight it with an army. So if he wanted to look divine, he had to look prepared. He had to look like he understood nature itself. So the question becomes dangerous. How does a ruler appear godlike in a world ruled by nature? You do it by controlling time. You do it by predicting what others cannot. You do it by creating a system so accurate that people begin to believe you are connected to the heavens. That is what a calendar is. Not paper, not numbers. A calendar is a weapon against uncertainty. It tells society, this is when the flood comes, this is when we plant, this is when we harvest, this is when we celebrate, this is when we obey. Because the calendar didn't only organize farming, it organized everything. It told workers when they must build temples. It told priests when festivals must happen. It told tax collectors when payments were due. And here's the key truth. When you control the calendar, you control people's lives. But Egypt needed something even more specific. They needed a sign more reliable than guessing the weather, a sign that lived beyond Earth, beyond human error. So Egypt looked at the one place that never stopped moving, the sky. And there, in that perfect ancient darkness, they noticed patterns. Stars returning, seasons shifting, the sun changing its path. And slowly they realized the sky was not random. It was a machine, a cosmic machine. So if they could understand the sky, they could predict the river. And if they could predict the river, they could feed the nation. And if they could feed the nation, they could build pyramids, they could build eternity. So Egypt didn't invent a calendar for comfort. Egypt invented a calendar for survival. And then it turned survival into authority. Because once the empire began living by dates, by rhythms, by predicted cycles, the calendar became more than timekeeping. It became power. And that's why the Egyptian calendar is one of the most important inventions in human history. Because it wasn't created to measure days. It was created to control a civilization. If you want to understand how ancient Egypt invented the 365-day calendar, you must first forget something modern people take for granted. You must forget that time comes from clocks, because in ancient Egypt, there were no clocks in the modern sense. No ticking seconds, no glowing screens, no printed calendars on walls. There was only the land, the river, and the sky. And when you live in a world like that, time doesn't feel like numbers. Time feels like signs. Time feels like patterns. Time feels like the universe speaking in a language you must learn, or you will starve. So let me ask you a question. If you had no technology, no telescope, no satellites, no scientific instruments, how would you measure a year? Would you count the days of heat and cold? Would you measure the river? Would you trust your memory? Or would you do what Egypt did, the most terrifyingly intelligent decision possible? Would you look up and treat the heavens like a book? Because that is exactly what they did. They did not only worship the sky, they studied it. They watched it the way a hunter watches footprints in the sand. Quiet, patient, obsessed. And this obsession wasn't poetry, it was survival. Now picture Egypt at night, thousands of years ago. No city lights, no electricity, no smoke covering the stars. Just an endless desert silence and a sky that feels too big for human minds. Stars weren't faint dots. They were sharp, burning signals. The Milky Way looked like a river of light poured across the heavens. And if you stood beside the Nile and looked up, you would understand why Egyptians believed gods lived above. But here is the important twist. Egyptians weren't only believers, they were observers. They noticed that the sky was not random, that stars did not move like chaos, that something invisible was controlling them. And when humans discover a pattern, they begin to count. So they began to ask questions that sound simple, but are actually dangerous. Why do some stars vanish and return? Why does the sun rise at a slightly different point each day? Why does the length of daylight change across the year? Why do certain constellations appear in certain seasons? And most importantly, is the sky repeating itself like a machine? Because if the sky repeats, then the future can be predicted. And if the future can be predicted, then Egypt can survive. Egypt's priests were the keepers of this knowledge. But don't imagine them only praying. Imagine them doing something closer to science. They recorded, they measured, they compared. They built memory across generations. They turned observation into discipline. Because when you live beside a river that decides whether your children eat or die, you learn to treat nature with absolute seriousness. And so, night after night, the priests watched the sky the way modern scientists watch computer screens. They learned the language of stars. And slowly they realized something revolutionary. The heavens could be used like a calendar. The stars could mark time more reliably than human memory ever could. The sky was consistent. The sky was repeating. The sky was telling the truth. And then they discovered the star that changed everything. A star so bright it seemed impossible to ignore. Sirius, the brightest star in the entire night sky. But Sirius wasn't important only because it was bright. It was important because it behaved like a signal. For a period each year, Sirius disappeared, hidden behind the sun's glare. And then, after days of waiting, it returned. It appeared at dawn for the first time, right before sunrise. This moment, its first reappearance, was so powerful that it became sacred. And here is the terrifying coincidence, or maybe not a coincidence at all. Soon after Sirius returned, the Nile flood would come. Think about what this means. If you are an ancient Egyptian priest and you notice this pattern, you don't just see astronomy. You see control. You see prediction. You see authority. Because once you can say, the flood is coming soon, and it happens, people will believe you understand the gods. People will believe you understand the universe. People will obey. So the Egyptians did what genius civilizations always do. They stopped guessing and started counting. They counted the days between one appearance of Sirius and the next. Again and again, year after year, they turned the sky into mathematics. They turned starlight into a number. And that number became the foundation of everything. 365 days. Not a myth, not a legend. a calculation, and it proves something most people are not ready to accept. Ancient Egypt did not invent its calendar by superstition. It invented it by observation, by memory, by discipline, by mathematics built from the sky itself. So when we say, the sky was their book, we mean it literally, because Egypt didn't need printed pages. Here's the part most people never think about. When we hear ancient Egypt created a calendar, we imagine something innocent, a way to count days, track seasons, maybe plan festivals. But that is not what a calendar truly is. A calendar is not just knowledge. A calendar is authority, because once you can control time, you can control people. So let me ask you something. In a world where most people cannot read, where there are no phones, no newspapers, no clocks on walls, who decides what day it is? Who decides when the year begins? Who decides when work starts, when rest is allowed, when taxes are due, when rituals must happen, and when the nation must obey? The answer is terrifyingly simple: the government. In Egypt, time was not personal. Time belonged to the state. And the calendar was the invisible chain that kept millions of people moving in the same direction. Because Egypt wasn't held together only by soldiers. It was held together by rhythm, a rhythm the rulers created. Think about how the empire worked. Egypt depended on agriculture, and agriculture depended on the Nile. So the calendar became a tool that controlled the most important resource in the nation: food. If the government could predict the flood season, it could order farmers: plant now, harvest now, deliver grain now. And suddenly the farmer's life was no longer guided by instinct. It was guided by dates. Dates written by scribes, dates announced by priests, dates approved by the palace. And that is where power becomes absolute. Because the government didn't just control land, it controlled the schedule of life. Now follow the chain. If you control farming seasons, you control food supply. If you control food supply, you control taxes. Because taxes in ancient Egypt were not paid with money, they were paid with grain. So the calendar told officials exactly when to collect, exactly when to measure, exactly when to store. And those storage buildings, granaries, became the heart of the empire. It wasn't just an economy, it was a machine, and time was the engine. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And comment below, was ancient Egypt the smartest civilization in history? See you in the next video.